"I never really saw myself living the life of a farmer," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "So I decided the wisest thing to do was to just call it quits. Get the hell out and find something else to do." Those words carried a quiet finality, the kind that marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But just as that decision settled in, something strange, something no one could explain, happened to Tony Beets' mine. Even the crew, hardened men who had seen all kinds of mishaps and mechanical chaos, couldn't make sense of it. Before we dive into the mystery of what really unfolded that day, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is a story that might stay with you long after it ends. It all began like any other ordinary morning in the Yukon. The air was icy, sharp enough to sting your cheeks, and a thin blanket of fog hugged the ground as if it had no intention of leaving anytime soon. The crew moved slowly but methodically, each man clutching a steaming mug of coffee, speaking in short, tired bursts. The atmosphere was filled with the usual morning soundtrack, the low rumble of diesel engines, the crunch of gravel beneath boots, the groan of metal waking from its rest, and the mechanical breathing of heavy machines preparing for another long day of work. Tony Beets was there too, pacing across the muddy site with his usual seriousness. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he moved, inspecting every detail like a man who knew the ground better than his own reflection. His cap was pulled low over his brow, his sharp eyes scanning, listening, reading the rhythm of the machines like a language only he understood. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Rick was probably the first to notice it, a strange noise that seemed to come from deep within the dredge. It was a dragging, low sound, one that didn't match the usual mechanical groans or grinding vibrations that came from jammed parts. This one felt heavier, stranger. At first, no one paid much attention. Out in the Yukon, strange noises were a part of everyday life. But the sound didn't fade. It persisted, low, steady, and oddly rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried somewhere beneath the frozen earth. Tony stopped mid-sentence, his expression tightening as he turned toward the dredge. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice cutting clean through the noise. Rick nodded, saying he thought it was coming from below. Tony frowned, the kind of frown that told everyone he didn't like what he was hearing, and began walking toward the dredge. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became. It pulsed through the metal, deep and unsettling. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The wind fell silent. Even the birds that circled above seemed to vanish. The only sound left was the faint crunch of Tony's boots pressing into the frostbitten earth. The air felt thicker somehow, like it was holding its breath. Tony stood a few feet from the dredge, staring at it with a strange intensity, as if he could see through the steel. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but the silence that followed made something inside him tighten. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "What's going on here?" Before anyone could answer, a loud creak echoed from inside the dredge, a deep metallic groan, like an old gate being forced open after decades of rust. The men froze, eyes snapping toward Tony. He motioned for them to stay back and called out quietly, "Someone get me a flashlight." Rick rushed off and returned moments later, handing him the light. Tony knelt, shining the beam along the lower side of the dredge. Something flickered, something wet, reflecting the beam faintly. He leaned closer, assuming it was a busted pipe or a leaking hose. But when his gloved hand brushed against it, he froze. It wasn't water. It was ice cold, colder than the Yukon air around them, and it clung to his glove like it was alive. When Tony lifted his hand closer to the light, everyone saw it shimmer, a faint, silver glow rippling just beneath the surface, like liquid metal that breathed. Tony blinked and instinctively rubbed his glove against his jeans to wipe it off. But instead of coming off, it spread, stretching thin across the fabric, almost crawling on its own. "What in the world is this?" he muttered, his voice low and uneasy. Rick leaned forward, holding the flashlight tighter, and that's when the thing began to move. It didn't drip or slide. It slithered, gliding along the dredge's surface, forming glowing, twisting lines that curled into circular shapes. The design that emerged was intricate, almost deliberate, as if something was writing through the light. The men stood motionless, their breath visible in the freezing air. "Everyone, step back," Tony said finally, his tone firm but quiet. They obeyed, moving slowly. And then, out of nowhere, the dredge groaned violently. A deep rumble rolled beneath their feet, shaking the ground. The lights flickered. One of the younger crewmen cursed under his breath, but Tony didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on that strange, glowing metal. Then they heard it, a voice. Faint. Muffled. Coming from inside the dredge. No one could make out the words, but it was enough to send chills through every man on sight. Did anyone else hear that? Tony barked. Rick swallowed hard, his face pale. Yeah, he whispered. It said something, but I couldn't catch it. The voice faded, replaced by a slow, deliberate clicking, like a heartbeat trying to start again. Tony took a cautious step forward, his breath fogging the air. He leaned toward the open chamber. And then, everything exploded into chaos. The dredge lurched violently, its chains rattling, the buckets clanging like thunder. The whole valley echoed with mechanical fury. Shut it down! Tony yelled, but no one was at the controls. The dredge was moving on its own. When the noise finally died, the massive machine stood still, silent, as if holding its breath. The crew stood frozen, wide-eyed, unsure what to do. Rick eventually climbed up to check, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Minutes passed with no sound. Then his voice broke the silence. Tony, you need to see this. Tony climbed up after him. What they found wasn't gold, or anything they'd ever mined before. It was something embedded deep in the dredge, half covered in dirt, partly fused with the metal itself. Tony crouched down and brushed the surface clean. For a long moment, he didn't move or speak. He just stayed. Rick whispered, "Boss, that's not from here." Tony didn't reply. He just gave Rick a sharp look that said, "Don't talk about this yet." Then, in a quiet but firm tone, he told everyone to shut the site down for the day. No explanations. No questions. Just silence. As the engines cooled and the wind returned, the site felt different. Heavy. Unsettled. Even the air seemed to move slower, whispering through the trucks like it carried secrets. That night, after everyone left, Tony stayed behind. The lights were dim, the cold Yukon night pressing in. He walked back toward the dredge, flashlight in hand, his boots echoing in the emptiness. He needed to see it again, to know it wasn't just his imagination. But when he reached the spot, it was gone. The dirt was disturbed, and there were faint scratches on the metal, as if something had been pulled free. Tony stood there in the beam of his flashlight, breathing slowly, staring into the dark. For a long time, he didn't move. Rick had come back, or so Tony thought at first. Maybe one of the boys had decided to sneak in for another look. But almost instantly, he realized that couldn't be true. If anyone had returned, he would have heard the trucks long before. Uneasy, Tony ran his hand slowly over the spot again, his movements hesitant. The surface was cold and damp beneath his fingertips, but there was something else, an unfamiliar, metallic scent, sharp and unsettling. It smelled faintly of rust mixed with burnt oil, a scent that didn't belong to the dredge or anything they had been working with. Turning around, he swept his flashlight across the dark corners and called out softly, "Rick, are you here?" His voice echoed, but there was no reply, only the soft tapping of the wind brushing against the metal walls. He waited, listening, but the silence didn't fade. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, almost alive, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, as if something unseen was watching and waiting. Tony climbed down slowly, his boots thudding against the steps, each sound unnaturally loud in the still night. When he finally reached the ground, he turned off his flashlight and looked around. The sky had cleared. Stars glittered so brightly that it felt as if they were hanging just above the treetops, silently observing. The camp was deserted. The generator sat dead. Even the dogs were silent, their usual restlessness replaced by uneasy stillness. Tony stood there, hands tucked deep into his jacket, his breath visible in the cold air. This wasn't the first strange thing that had happened on that claim, but this time felt different, personal, almost deliberate. Whatever was buried inside that dredge didn't want to be found. At dawn, Tony returned earlier than usual. The rest of the crew, Rick, Caleb, and the others, were already gathered around a small fire, their voices low and uneasy. When Tony approached, their conversation stopped at once. No one dared mention what had happened the previous night, and Tony didn't bring it up either. He simply nodded and headed toward the dredge. But before he could climb up, he froze. The door leading inside was half open. He was certain he'd locked it the night before. He always did. After a tense pause, he pushed it open. The metal door groaned loudly, releasing a wave of cold air that felt even sharper than the morning wind. Inside, the floor was slick with condensation, and across it were footprints, small, muddy footprints leading deeper into the dredge. Tony bent down to trace one with his fingers. They weren't his men's, their boots were larger. These looked lighter, like they belonged to someone smaller. Someone who shouldn't have been there. His breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the hollow structure. Then came a whisper, faint, unintelligible, but enough to raise every hair on his arms. Slowly, Tony backed away, keeping his eyes on the dark until he stepped outside. The cold air hit him hard, reminding him that the world beyond the dredge was still real. Rick approached moments later, asking quietly, "Find anything?" Tony looked at him, then shook his head. "Nothing," he lied, though both of them knew the truth. That day, work carried on, but the dredge remained untouched. Even when Tony ordered the crew to restart operations, they hesitated, mumbling about the hydraulics or the pump not being ready. Deep down, they all felt it, the heavy presence that seemed to hang over the machine, as if the dredge itself was alive and aware. That night, when the camp had gone silent again, a faint light flickered inside the dredge. Only one man saw it, a worker who had woken to use the bathroom. He swore he'd seen a figure moving inside, bending over something that glowed softly before vanishing. The next morning, that same man didn't show up for work. By sunrise, the entire camp had changed. The air felt thicker, the quiet heavier. The men looked drained, not from work, but from the kind of fear that seeps into your bones and never lets go. They claimed they heard faint movements in the night or saw pale lights flicker near the dredge, yet none dared check. Tony stood outside his cabin, a cup of coffee long gone cold in his hand, staring toward the dredge. The steam from the cup rose, then vanished into the air, just like his thoughts. He didn't move. He didn't blink much either. It was as if he was waiting, for something he could sense but couldn't name. Rick joined him after a while, his steps slow and heavy. He didn't say hello, he just stood beside Tony, both men staring silently at the same unsettling sight. Finally, Rick exhaled. "It feels wrong to keep working here, boss." Tony didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of his cold coffee and murmured, "Yeah, I know." But his eyes never left the dredge. Something about it seemed to pull him in, refusing to let him walk away. They tried to carry on as usual. The crew busied themselves fixing old parts and cleaning tools, avoiding eye contact, and steering clear of the dredge. Yet the air around it grew stranger. Every now and then, the men swore they could hear a low hum, like a machine still running even though it was switched off. Sometimes, they thought they saw the metal shift or shimmer faintly under the light. Around noon, Caleb approached, holding the tarp that had been covering the strange piece of metal they'd found by the river. He looked pale. "Boss," he said, "that thing we found, it's changing." Tony frowned and pulled back the tarp. His heart froze. The carvings on the metal were different. What had once been deep, rough lines now appeared smoother, almost melted, reshaped into new patterns. The crew leaned in silently. Rick squinted. "You think it's reacting to something?" Tony didn't answer right away. His gaze locked on one mark, a perfect circle, shaped like an eye. It hadn't been there before. When he brushed it with his fingers, he could have sworn it moved beneath his touch. He pulled back sharply, pulse racing. "Wrap it back up," he said quietly. "And don't leave it out again." The men obeyed, but unease spread through them like frost. Wrapping it didn't feel like protection. It felt like imprisonment. By late afternoon, an eerie calm fell over the camp. The sky looked peaceful but felt wrong, pale and strained. Tony sat on the old wooden steps outside his cabin, staring at the dredge again. The wind creaked softly against the metal, whispering sounds that didn't belong to nature. Rick appeared once more, holding a piece of paper. "Boss, we found this near the shed." Tony unfolded it. It was a rough pencil sketch of the dredge, old and worn, with markings beneath it that mirrored the carvings on the strange metal. None of the men had drawn it, yet it looked ancient, like it had been waiting for them all along. That night, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled through camp. The crew built a fire, huddling close, but even the flames seemed weak. Then, sometime after midnight, the generator went dead. Darkness swallowed everything except the moonlight and the flicker of the dying fire. Tony grabbed his flashlight and, despite the others' protests, walked toward the dredge once more. The closer he got, the colder the air became until even his breath hung thick in the dark. The dredge loomed before him, silent, massive, yet somehow awake. The ground beneath his boots was softer than before, disturbed. When he shone his light, he froze. Footprints again, but not the small, childlike ones from before. These were larger, deeper, as if someone heavy had dragged something behind them. They led from the dredge to the spot where the metal artifact had been kept. Tony followed them carefully, his light trembling in his hand. Behind him, one of the men tried to speak, but Tony turned, eyes sharp, and said, "Let's not talk about it here." The next day passed in tense silence. No one went near the dredge. The sound of tools clanging and the hum of the generator filled the air, but beneath it all, something else stirred. Then, in the late afternoon, it began again. The dredge made a sound, not a groan of metal or a mechanical rattle, but a deep, resonant hum, coming from somewhere beneath the ground. At first, they thought it was the wind. Then they realized it wasn't stopping. One by one, the men froze, tools slipping from their hands. Tony rushed from the shed, shouting, "Cut the generator!" But even when everything went still, the sound continued, a low, steady hum that pulsed like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was alive. For a long, tense moment, no one dared to move. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with something unspoken. Silence hung over the group like a weight. No words, no footsteps, not even the sound of a loud breath broke it. Then Tony, doing his best to keep his composure, finally spoke. "All right, everyone, take a break," he said, his voice steady though his trembling hands betrayed the fear beneath his calm exterior. The crew didn't argue. Without protest, they scattered quietly, some whispering in uneasy tones as they walked toward their trucks. When they were gone, only Tony and Rick remained behind. Tony rubbed his forehead wearily before murmuring, "You heard it too, didn't you?" Rick gave a hesitant nod. "Yeah, I did." "What was that, Tony?" Tony didn't answer right away. He walked slowly toward the dredge, placing his hand on the cold, rusted metal. "It's still in there," he whispered. Rick frowned, confused. "What's still in there?" Tony turned, giving him a look that sent a chill down his spine. "The thing we found, Rick, it never left. I think it's part of this dredge now." Rick laughed nervously, trying to dismiss it as paranoia. "Come on, man. You're making it sound like it's alive." But Tony didn't laugh. His face stayed grim and distant. He had seen something like this before, years ago, when a flood nearly claimed the dredge. The expression he wore now was that of a man standing too close to something far beyond his understanding. That night, long after everyone had gone home, Tony stayed behind. He sat inside the dredge, a single lantern glowing beside him. The weak, flickering light stretched long shadows across the metal walls. Even though every machine was shut off, Tony could still hear that faint, rhythmic hum. It wasn't mechanical anymore. It seemed to pulse from deep within the structure itself. He reached into his bag, pulled out the strange fragment they had found, and placed it on the table. His heart skipped a beat. The piece was glowing now, a faint, steady pulse like a heartbeat. Tony leaned closer, his breath shaky. "What are you?" he whispered. Then, something happened that Tony would never speak of again. The glow intensified, flooding the entire dredge with light for a brief, blinding moment. Every wall gleamed, and for an instant, Tony saw shapes, dark, moving forms that didn't belong to his shadow. His chest tightened. He stumbled backward, heart racing, as the hum deepened and the air vibrated around him. Then, just as suddenly, everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, dawn light was spilling through the windows. The lantern was dead, the dredge silent, and the fragment gone. Tony climbed down, legs trembling, and stepped into the cold morning air. Everything around him looked normal, but something felt wrong, like the world itself had shifted slightly while he was asleep. He looked toward the water and saw faint ripples gliding across the surface, even though the wind was still. Moments later, Rick arrived and saw Tony standing by the water's edge, motionless. "What happened?" Rick asked quietly. Tony didn't respond. He just stared at the ripples, eyes distant. Rick followed his gaze. "You think it's down there, don't you?" he asked. Tony finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not down there, Rick. It's everywhere now." Rick frowned, about to question him further, but Tony turned and walked away. He didn't explain, didn't look back, didn't even glance at the dredge. That night, when the crew returned, they found Tony's truck parked in its usual place. The engine was still warm, but Tony was gone. His boots sat neatly beside the door, and on the seat lay a small scrap of paper with a few scribbled words. No one ever said what those words were. After that, strange things began happening. Some claimed the dredge still hummed on cold nights when the wind was just right. Others swore they could hear footsteps inside, slow, steady, echoing through the hollow metal corridors. No one was brave enough to check. As days passed with no sign of Tony, the crew grew uneasy. At first, they hoped he had just needed time to clear his head. But when weeks went by without a trace, they realized something was truly wrong. The mine felt empty without Tony's booming voice, his early morning calls to get the trucks running or check the lines. Rick did his best to lead, but the place had lost its heartbeat. The dredge loomed silently, like it was guarding a secret none of them wanted to know. Whenever the wind blew, the metal creaked softly, and everyone would stop for just a second, listening, uncertain if the sound was just the wind or something else moving inside. One particularly cold night, Rick sat in his truck after everyone had gone home. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and cold. He stared through his windshield at the dredge's dark outline. He'd promised himself he'd never go near it again, but that night, something felt different. It was as if the dredge was calling to him, quietly, patiently. He sat for a long while, tapping his fingers nervously on the steering wheel before finally grabbing his flashlight and stepping out. Gravel crunched under his boots as he approached. In the pale moonlight, he thought he saw faint glowing lines running along the dredge's surface, the same markings that had been on the fragment. He blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks, but the light was real. Climbing the ladder slowly, every step echoing in the silence, he reached the top and swept his flashlight around. Everything looked still, yet the air felt heavy, as if he wasn't alone. "Tony, you here?" Rick called softly, but only his echo replied. Then he heard it again, a soft, steady hum coming from deep within. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he followed the sound back to the same spot where they had first found the object. The ground looked disturbed. Kneeling, he brushed the dirt aside and felt something smooth beneath the surface. Another fragment, smaller, but glowing faintly. He picked it up, whispering, "Tony." The hum grew louder, the ground vibrating under his feet. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out. In the dim silver light of the moon, a shape appeared on the metal wall, tall, solid, moving with eerie calm. It wasn't his shadow. Rick's heart pounded. The dredge seemed to breathe, the air colder now. Then he heard a voice, a familiar, rough voice that froze his blood. Tony's voice. He spun around, but no one was there. The sound vanished, leaving only silence. Shaking, Rick clutched the glowing fragment and whispered, "Tony, where are you, man?" Then he ran, down the ladder, across the gravel, straight to his truck. He slammed the door shut and sat gasping for breath. Through the windshield, he could still see that faint glow near the top of the dredge. "What the hell is happening here?" he muttered. Rick never told anyone what he saw that night, but the others noticed how he changed. He jumped at every noise and couldn't stop glancing toward the dredge. Tony was never the same either. Some said they saw him wandering near the site long after dark. No light, no tools, just standing there, listening. Nobody knew why. People still argue about what they found that day. Some claim it was gold. Others insist it was something else, something they weren't supposed to discover. The stories vary depending on who you ask, but they all agree on one thing. Whatever it was, it changed Tony forever. Now, when the wind blows through the valley, locals say you can still hear the dredge hum softly, like a heartbeat under the earth. Some nights, faint lights flicker inside, glowing for just a moment before vanishing. Tourists visit, take photos, and leave quickly. The locals don't look at it much anymore. They say the silence there feels too alive, like if you listen long enough, you'll start to feel it breathe. And when the sun sets low, turning the sky rusty orange, a soft light sometimes flickers inside the dredge, as if someone turned it on and forgot to turn it off. But when anyone goes near, the glow disappears, leaving only the cold creak of metal and the whisper of water moving through the dark.